The Shawshank Redemption is a 1994 American drama film written and directed by Frank Darabont. The film is based on the 1982 novella by Stephen King called Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption. This film tells the story of a banker sentenced to life at Shawshank State Penitentiary for the gruesome murders of his wife and her lover. Indeed, this one is a great ride, full of love, friendship, and betrayal. What is the cost of freedom? And how far can you go to prove your innocence? Today, we explore the film The Shawshank Redemption, a story that gives meaning to trust and betrayal. Though the video contains spoilers, get ready to enjoy the content. The film is set in the year 1947 in Portland, Maine. Banker Andy Dufresne is at trial for the murder of his wife and her lover. The theory explained by the prosecutor states that Andy found out about the affair and confronted his wife. Instead, the wife was happy she had been found out as she was getting tired of sneaking around. She asks Andy for a divorce and he refuses. She packs her belongings and goes to her lover's house. Later that evening, Andy is seen drunk out of his mind in a car outside the lover's house. He has a gun on him, which he carelessly loads and gets outside. However, in court, Andy says he never committed the murders as the two lovers were not home. Instead, he drove off and threw his gun in a river. The fact that the gun was never found and Andy's fingerprints and shoe marks were found all over the victim's house makes the judge rule him guilty and sends him to serve 2 life sentences in prison back to back. Meanwhile, we see an inmate, Ellis Redding, appear before a parole board, but his case is rejected. He has been in the prison for 20 years. Red explains that he's the prison's contraband smuggler and can get anyone anything at a fair price. In the prison, an alarm goes off signaling the arrival of new inmates, and all the other prisoners clamber to the gate. Red and his friends have a weird tradition of betting against which new meat would crack first. Red bets for Andy. The first night in prison is when most people grasp their new reality, and the question of people breaking down is not new. Red thinks Andy was born with a silver spoon, so he would definitely win him the bet. After lights out and the guards leave, the other inmates start mocking and cajoling the new inmates as a way of entertaining themselves. A friend of Red had bet against the fat guy and he makes fun of him, causing him to break down. The guards hear the inmates laugh at the guy and get in. They try to get the fat guy to shut up, but he doesn't, so the guards beat him up. In the prison, there's an old man called Brooks. He had served 50 years. He works as the librarian, giving the inmates books and magazines. Red reveals that for over a month, Red never spoke more than a few words to anyone, and when he finally did, he wanted Red to give him a rock hammer. At first, Red thinks Andy wants the hammer so he can dig his way out of the prison. But Andy smugly says he will see how wrong his theory is when he sees the size of the rock hammer. Unfortunately, despite Andy's solitary life, he falls victim to a gang called the Sisters. The gang is notorious for sexual assault, and Andy gets victimized a couple of times. He's assigned to work in the prison laundry, making it a perfect location for the assault. Each day, he has new injuries courtesy of the Sisters' leader, Boggs. Sometimes he manages to fend them off, but other times he's not as lucky. One day, the warden informs the prisoners that some of them would be chosen for outdoor detail. They are to tar the roof, and Red knows any chance to get outside the prison is gold. Andy is among the ones chosen, and as they work, he overhears the captain of the guards, Byron Hadley, complaining about the taxes he has to pay. He had recently gotten some inheritance from his deceased brother, but with the tax law, he's sure to only get peanuts of the cash. Andy stops working and approaches Hadley. Of course, this is not taken lightly, and he's about to be thrown off the roof when he reveals he knows how Hadley can get all the money without paying taxes. Andy reveals that if Hadley gifts the inheritance money to his wife, he'll not be taxed. He offers to draw up the paperwork for the transaction, and Hadley asks him what he wants in return. Andy asks for 3 bottles of cold beer for each of the workers on the roof. As the group drinks the beer, Andy sits at a corner watching them, and Red states Andy had learned the most valuable lesson of all. He needed a group of people he could trust. Well, he's surely chosen well. Andy visits Red in the entertainment room and asks for a large Rita Hayworth poster. As he is leaving, the sisters capture him and they try to assault him orally, but Andy threats to bite Boggs down there. Boggs is scared, and while the group does not assault him sexually that night, they beat him within an inch of his life. Andy spends a month in the infirmary, while Boggs only got a week in solitary confinement. When Boggs enters his cell, he finds Hadley waiting for him. The guard beats and cripples Boggs, who is subsequently transferred to another prison. The sisters never attack anyone else, and Boggs has to eat with a straw for the rest of his life. Red charges his friends with looking for soapstones for Andy as a welcome back. Andy wants the stones as he's into stone carving, and Red also gets Andy the poster for free. One time, the warden, Samuel Norton, and his guards conduct an impromptu search of the cells. Norton meets up with Andy and wants him to help him with some financial stuff. Norton also reassigns Andy to the prison library so he can assist Brooks. In the real sense, the library is a front allowing him to manage financial matters for the other prison guards, guards from other prisons, and most importantly, the warden himself. Andy realizes the prison library is in a sorry state, but when he asks the warden for money, Norton replies the resources are already stretched out thin. Andy begins writing weekly letters to the state legislator requesting funds to improve the library and stock up on some books. Andy's work gets so vast that he's allowed a staff, and lets in Red and a few of his friends. One time, Brooks holds a fellow inmate, Haywood, at knife point. It turns out Brooks's parole is due and he's scared of going back to the world. After his release, the boys get a letter from Brooks who explains how tough it has been to adjust, and that he committed suicide. Good news soon reaches Andy, and the state sends him a $200 check and some books for the library. There is also a recording of the marriage of Figaro, which Andy plays over the public address system after locking the guards outside. He's punished with solitary confinement. After his release from solitary, Andy explains that hope is what gets him through his time, a concept that Red dismisses. In 1963, Norton begins exploiting prison labor for public works, profiting by undercutting skilled labor costs and receiving bribes. Andy launders the money under a pseudo-name, Randall Steffens, for Norton. Norton trusts Andy completely. Even with the password to the safe, he keeps the illegal documents. One day, Tommy Williams joins the prison after being incarcerated for burglary. Tommy befriends Andy and Red. Andy decides to help Tommy learn to read and write after he receives the help he needed to build the library, and helps Tommy continuously until he passes his general education development exam. Tommy nearly gives up, but he manages to do it for his wife and child. A year later, Tommy reveals that at his previous prison, he was roommates with a guy who talked non-stop about the violent crimes he had committed. One time, he confesses to killing Andy's wife and lover after a robbery gone wrong. Andy realizes this is proof of his innocence and takes the case to Norton. Norton dismisses the story, saying Tommy is creating a story so he can appease Andy, his mentor. Norton refuses to listen, and when Andy mentions money laundering, Norton sends him back to solitary confinement for a month. Norton has Hadley murder Tommy under the guise of an escape attempt. Andy attempts to discontinue the laundering but relents after Norton threatens to destroy the library, remove Andy's protection from the guards, and move him to worse conditions. Andy sinks into a depressive state 19 years into his sentence. One time, Andy approaches Andy, who is feeling remorse for his wife's death, by blaming himself for being a bad husband. He tells Red that he dreams of living in Zihuatanejo, a beautiful Mexican coastal town. He invites Red there, saying he could do with a smuggler like him. Andy asks Red if he thinks he will ever get free, and Red says he will when he's old and gray. As he leaves, Andy tells Red of a specific hayfield near Buxton, where he says if Red ever gets released, he should retrieve a package Andy had buried there. Red starts worrying for Andy's safety and mental well-being, and this moment is a sad one between the two guys united by very different circumstances. The concern is worse when Haywood reveals Andy asked for a rope. His friends believe Andy would never commit suicide, but Red fears Andy has reached his breaking point. That evening, Andy deposits documents in Norton's safe, and the warden leaves for the night after telling Andy to clean his clothes and brush his shoes. Andy walks through the prison corridors into his cell until the lights go out. He retrieves the rope from under his pillow, and we see a sleepless Red, scared for his friend's well-being. The next morning, during the parade, Andy is nowhere to be seen, and the guards check his room. Everyone is scared, expecting the worst. But surprisingly, Andy is not in his cell. Red is called to Andy's room to be interviewed, as no one can find an answer to Andy's disappearance. In a fit of rage, the warden throws some stones at Rita's picture, revealing a tunnel from which he escaped. He had dug the tunnel using the rock hammer Red had gotten him for the 19 years he was in. We learn Andy had taken the ledger with proof of the money laundering and escaped using the rope from earlier from the prison sewage pipes. Desperate times and really desperate measures. While the guards look for Andy, Andy disguises himself as Randall Stevens and withdraws $370,000 of Norton's money as severance. He also sends evidence of the corruption and murders to a local newspaper, and the news hits the front page. Norton opens the safe and finds a Bible instead of the ledger, and police sirens can be heard. The police arrest Hadley, but Norton commits suicide by shooting himself. After the escape, Red gets a postcard from Fort Hancock, and he envisions his friend traveling across the border to live his dream. Despite the rejoicing in his heart, he still misses his friend. The following year, Red is finally paroled after serving 40 years. He struggles to adapt outside of prison and fears that he never will. His boss at the supermarket he works for is very harsh on him, and the hardships make him wish he can go back. Remembering his promise to Andy, he visits Buxton and finds a cache containing money and a letter asking him to come to Zihuatanejo. Red violates his parole by traveling to Fort Hancock, Texas, and crossing the border into Mexico, admitting that he finally feels hope. He finds Andy on a beach in Zihuatanejo, and the two reunited friends happily embrace. Our story has come to an end, but wait, check out this crazy video where a girl develops a new personality so she can get revenge against those who wronged her. Also subscribe to this channel for more recaps of your favorite movies. See you next time, take care.